Okay, hello everybody. I hope everybody's doing well. I'm chatting today with a guy who goes by the name of Noam Kissinger about foreign policy. Obviously, this is motivated by current events and the situation in Ukraine. And yeah, he's called Noam Kissinger. Also, as you can see, has a picture of Obi-Wan as his profile picture. So we'll let him explain that in a bit. But so hi, Noam, if you could just like introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about your background and your interest in foreign policy.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just start out with the name. I'm not a Henry Kissinger fan. It's just a name. I thought it'd be funny. I figured everybody would understand it's ironic. I guess it's kind of confusing sometimes. So I'm not a Henry Kissinger or a Noam Chomsky stan or anything. So just get that out of the way. Yeah. So I deal primarily with foreign policy when it comes to like stuff on Twitter or if I'm talking to other people. My job is more defense intelligence related. So it's less foreign policy heavy and more specifically about security studies or what different countries are doing. And so if anybody's been following this on Twitter, you'll see a good mix of both. You'll see some accounts that are foreign policy, maybe professors or people who work at think tanks that are talking more about the side of, okay, what is Russia's thinking? What is the United States or NATO going to be responding with? And then you'll have other accounts that do open source intelligence. You'll see it's called OSINT. And they'll be doing, okay, this group here was destroyed or these Russian forces are here. So for my job, I do more stuff of, okay, these Russian forces are here. But I also like to dabble into the foreign policy side as well. And then hopefully eventually down the line, I'll just be doing mostly foreign policy. But for now, my job is mostly intelligence.
Okay, great, thank you. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? So the distinction between those two roles in your job.
Yeah, so whenever we're talking about foreign policy, when people speak of foreign policy, they are talking about more stuff that would be related to the State Department or something like that. It would be, okay, what is our relations with the country going to be? What are our policies towards this certain action going to be? Whereas when you're talking about more defense and intelligence related, it's that stuff doesn't take a backseat necessarily, but it's more, in the passenger seat in a sense of, okay, now we're moving forces around. How are we going to move 10,000 troops here? Where should we move 10,000 troops somewhere? How are we going to relate to our strategy and stuff like that? So it's less about the best way to think of it is a foreign policy is more general and defense related issues or intelligence are going to be specific after you figured out the general understanding. So if I come up with okay, Russia is the bad guy or something like that, and we want to be more aggressive towards Russia, okay, what's the next step? Okay, now defense or intelligence is going to come in and say, okay, we're going to move troops here, or we're going to do something like that. That's just an example, right? So in my job, I do more defense related intelligence stuff. So doing assessments on maybe what countries are doing whatever, it just depends on what I'm doing that day. But on Twitter and stuff like that, I do like to dabble in foreign policy. And then for school and stuff like that, obviously you can't really get a degree in intelligence. You have to do foreign policy. And then hopefully, one day I'll be able to do foreign policy stuff, maybe a PhD program or something like that. But for now, my job is defense intel.
Okay, that's a really good way of putting it. So foreign policy is like the sort of overarching thing, setting out, the plans, the aims, the strategies, whilst defense is like much more
Hmm.
specific and getting into like the nitty gritty details.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool, cool. So do you have? So I suppose that's kind of like that's like a bit of a meta perspective on your foreign policy, or your whole background on foreign policy slash intelligence. Do you have like any specific interests or like things that you focus on, like specific countries or areas?
So I used to do a heavy focus on China and the South China Sea specifically at my not my last job because I still have the same job, but the last specific place I was working before this. Um, and so now I've kind of switched over to more doing stuff in Russia. Obviously, that's a big thing before, but my switch had already happened before this whole thing and it happened. So it was kind of interesting to make that switch, thinking that I was going to be doing going over stuff that was not as, I wouldn't say not as important, but not as popular. Obviously, the Biden administration, I'm from America, the Biden administration is trying to do a shift towards Asia. So I thought I was going to be moving from China to maybe something less focused on in the world. But then, Russia invaded Ukraine and turned out to be the most focused on thing. So it's kind of interesting to be able to shift towards that. But yeah, I use primarily stuff in the naval side. But, when you're doing intel, you have to pretty much cover a lot of broad things.
Right. Okay. Okay. So how long ago did you shift to Russia?
Just last year, I switched to.
Yeah.
I moved to a different, not like a building, but like a different area in my job. So
Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So you didn't expect it to sort of the events of the past few weeks, right?
yeah,
So I mean, so yeah, that's a natural kind of segue into what we want to talk to you about, and what I want to pick your brains about, right? Which is obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
hmm
So I've got quite a lot of questions for you that I've been writing down enthusiastically today. But we'll see how far we get. But I mean, the first thing I was wondering about, because you hear kind of both sides of this. On the one hand, there's obviously a huge impact on Ukrainians. Russia is killing a lot of people. It's advancing towards cities,
hmm
and that's undoubtedly a terrible thing. But on the other
right,
hand, you do hear a lot of stories about how they're actually not that being that successful. How they've botched some of their
right.
logistics. How the Ukrainian population has stood up to them perhaps more than they expected, or more than anyone expected. So overall,
hmm
I mean, how would you say things are going so far for Russia versus Ukraine?
Yeah, they are. It is definitely not untrue to say that they are not performing as not only as well as other people thought, but as well as the Russian Ministry of Defense figured they would, which is for Russia the worst part because you always want to, at the very least, you always want to overestimate or underestimate your abilities, so that way you prepare more. That's one of the famous things that the United States is known for is over preparing. In the Gulf War, if you've ever seen any stuff like that, it was a pretty much an unfair fight. We had a thousand different countries joining us because we vastly overestimated Iraq's ability. In this instance, or Russia specifically, very vastly underestimated not only Ukraine's ability to fight back militarily, but the West, NATO, EU, United States ability to come together and come up with a cohesive strategy, to a cohesive strategy to specifically, fight back Russia, which was in their calculus was something that they did not expect. A lot of the reason, a lot of the reasoning behind why they chose to invade now compared to some other time in the past or some other time in the future, is that this really did seem like one of the best times to invade because America had just gotten out of the war in Afghanistan, and so domestically, people here are very much not did not want to go to war. We were done with it. It was 20 plus years of war, and so we were very much eager to get out of using our military. And from the British, or not the British side, but from the European side, a lot of different countries were very heavily relied on Russian gas and oil, specifically Germany. And then France as well was going through an election period where one of the top runners was someone who was more aligned with Vladimir Putin and less aligned with NATO and the EU, specifically Marie Le Pen. But so from the political side, it definitely did seem like Russia was saying, okay, well, if I'm going to invade, this is the best time for me to do because I'll likely face the lowest consequences. That turned out not to be true because the U.S. NATO and the EU were very much willing, surprisingly, and to a lot of people's surprise, not just Vladimir Putin's, to my surprise as well, were willing to come together and come up with a different strategy that was cohesive and unified. And they were also willing to do a lot of things that a lot of people did not think they were doing, like SWIFT. If you'll remember, months before, people were talking about, well, what are some of the sanctions you might do if Russia invades? And SWIFT was kind of seen as this one that was, that's probably not going to happen, that is really going to hurt, some of the other countries. And then all of a sudden it just did happen and everyone was on board. So from the economic side, Russia definitely underestimated its opponents, which were going to be EU and NATO. And on the military side, their military is very much top heavy. And so when I say that, is their officers, which are the people at the top, people who are going to be telling people what to do, are pretty good at their job. They are trained really well. They're very well educated, especially some of their higher up military officers are very good at like military strategy. But the people at the bottom are not really taken care of very well. A lot of, specifically in this military, there's been talks of a lot of conscripts and a lot of people in the reserve that are not, when you're in a reserve, you don't do the military every day. You do it once a month maybe or something like that. And then you have another day job. And so a lot of the problems that Russia is facing are, like you mentioned, in logistics. They are not able to move forces where they want. If you've seen pictures on Twitter, you'll see pictures of 40-mile long roads filled with trucks and tanks and stuff like that, because they are, they're essentially bottlenecked trying to get people in Kyiv. And then you also see plenty of videos of just not even destroyed, just abandoned fully functional tanks or armored vehicles because people ran out of gas. And so taking it from the side of the United States strategy for defense is 100% built around logistics. Logistics is one of the most important things. It doesn't matter how good your military is if they can't move, because if they can't move, then they're stuck. You're not able to invade. You're not able to defend. You're not able to move forces around where they need to be going. And so a lot of the U.S.'s strategy is built around protecting logistics, being able to move logistics, the fluid motion of whether you are refueling or whether you are moving ammunition around or whether you're moving airplanes around, whatever it is. We have an entire command. It's called Transcom. That is the U.S. Transportation Command that is just designed to transport stuff around, which is, kind of rare in militaries. It's that the United States focuses so heavy on that, which Russia is kind of doing the opposite. They very much were not focused on it. They kind of figured that they would be able to roll in, and that a lot of, probably similar to the way it was in Afghanistan, where a lot of people either fled or surrendered or joined the other side. And it is definitely not as good for Russia. They've been taking a lot more losses than Ukrainians have. They have a much higher amount of deaths. They have a much higher amount of planes shot down. Now, this is not as surprising. This doesn't really say as much to the military, because the Russian military is going to be moving in giant bulks, whereas the Ukrainian military is going to be moving in much smaller regiments and stuff like that. And so if Russia takes out an entire group of Ukrainians, that's going to be a lot smaller number compared to if Ukraine takes out a large number or a giant number of Russians, right? Because so the deaths amount is not necessarily surprising. It's more of just the way that they are moving forces around.
Right.
But,
yeah.
Yeah. The unfortunate thing for Ukraine is that Russia on its worst day still beats out Ukraine on its best day. And hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully a lot of people are wrong. But, at the end of the day, they have a larger number of troops. They have a much, much larger number of troops. And they have just a better military, even if it's underperforming. So, if you look at the way it is right now, Kiev which is the capital of Ukraine, is essentially being surrounded. So even though they're having logistical issues, it does look like they are able to, somewhat take a step, or Russia is somewhat able to take a step back and slow down a little bit, and then unfortunately push forward. So yeah, they have had a lot of issues, but that still doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be able to be successful in the sense of being able to invade.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, somebody just a small question. Somebody in the chat asked it, and it also occurred to me. Do you know of reliable figures on of the losses on both sides up until now?
Yeah, so that's kind of the issue with dealing with stuff like that is that we either have to get numbers from Russia, which we probably
Mm.
shouldn't trust, or we have to get numbers from Ukraine, which we should maybe trust a little bit more, but it's not going to be 100%. So I think the numbers that Ukraine has pushed out is about 10,000 Russian troops have been killed. And then they're kind of estimating on the amount of airplanes that have been shot down or
Mm.
tanks. Um, I would say probably the accurate number is more around like maybe like 5,000 Russian troops at this point. We don't really know the number of Ukrainian troops, and the unfortunate thing is that U.S. and Western intelligence is not in the country, right? Well, I guess it's unfortunate because that would be World War III, but we have to verify what people are saying, and a lot of this stuff is being pushed out on Twitter, and so it's not as reliable. So it's very difficult
Yeah.
for us to. We mostly have to say, okay, what number do they get? Okay, how many can we verify for sure? And then how many do we think is going to happen? Because those are going to be three different numbers. The amount of we can verify is going to be very low because it's very rare. It's not rare, but it's not always that you're going to get a kill or a shot down of an airplane on video. And so the amount that we can verify is going to be lower, and then the amount that's actually happening is going to be in between what we can verify and what they're saying. So I would say that whatever Ukraine says is probably the maximum possibility of deaths, which is
Mm.
around 10,000. And then it's probably a little bit lower than that. Russia, I think, has only ever confirmed 500 or like less than 500 Russian troops have died, which is obviously nowhere true. And I think for tanks, it's been about like 100, a little over 100 tanks and armored vessels or armored vehicles. And then for airplanes, it's probably a little over 30 airplanes, including helicopters that have been taken down. But it's just kind of difficult because when you're dealing with intelligence, we can get more classified stuff, so we can get a more accurate number. But
Mm.
obviously, we can't put that out on Twitter because it's classified information. So
Yeah.
yeah, those are numbers that I would guesstimate. Just maybe a little bit over 5,000, 30 aircraft taken down, and then well over 100 armored vehicles taken down.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the you see, there are quite a few videos on Twitter of Russian tanks getting towed away by like tractors and stuff by Ukrainian
Right.
farmers. Which I've quite enjoyed watching those.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, so essentially, your view is that Putin perhaps underestimated the situation. Maybe he's
Mhm.
a bit deluded or arrogant, but by sheer brute force and manpower, it seems likely to you that Russia will be able to take the major cities.
It seems like, and so obviously this is dependent on if there's some type of peace deal push forward or if something happens that we didn't predict. Like if Vladimir Putin is assassinated or something like that, something crazy. And so I think that if Russia decides to continue the invasion, that if they don't stop doing what they're doing now, they will likely be able to take the entire country, and that means the entire border of Ukraine. Now, the entire border of Ukraine, is going to take probably months. I would say, maybe well over 4 months. I think the estimate that they thought was going to happen would be, less than 2 months. But obviously, their estimates are not very accurate at this point.
Hmm.
So I would say, yeah, they are likely going to take a lot of that land. Right now, the biggest areas are Kyiv. So Kyiv is kind of being surrounded. A lot of the Russian forces so there's a giant river that splits Ukraine in half called the Dnipro, and it goes through Kyiv as well, which, like I said, is the capital. So most of the Russian forces are kind of surrounding around Kyiv. The Ukrainian forces are kind of centered in the middle of the city, obviously, to defend it. And so Russia has a lot of ability to move forces outside of Kyiv. So they're moving forces from the north and then pushing out west where there's no Ukrainian forces. So that way they can kind of regroup. And they're going to try to do a multi-pronged attack. So, attacking from the northwest and then attacking from the southwest. And then they've also moved forces from the east. And so they're going to try to come up multiple fronts and then essentially take Kyiv. Now, the thinking for Russia is that once you take the city, then you essentially decapitate Ukraine's ability to command and control. And in defense, command and control, which is also called C2, is essentially a military's ability to command forces and control forces, which is where the command and control comes in. So that is military generals telling their forces, okay, you move here, you move here. Okay, colonel, major, whatever, you go do forces there. They're controlling their forces and controlling the battlefield. Now, if you take the city, now, in Russia's thinking, okay, if we take the capital, then they're going to have less of an ability to move forces, right? Just like if somebody was invading America, if you took Washington, D.C., the Pentagon's not able to operate anymore. Now you have a decoupled military, and you have decoupled it from their generals, right? That's most likely true. I don't know what Ukraine's ability to be able to command and control their forces outside of Kyiv is. I hope that they still are able to move forces. It's likely that they've prepared for Kyiv to fall and that they've already moved a lot of their command and control to some other city. But right now, their big focus, Russia's big focus is they've stopped a lot of the attacks on other cities, so that way they can move forces into Kyiv, and then they're just going to try to take Kyiv as quickly as possible. In the south, that is where they have been taking that has been where they've been taking most of the land that they have. That is their most successful area, is in the south by Crimea and by the Black Sea. So they just created a land bridge from the forces in the very south, which if you go to the Institute for the Study of War, they have a really good map on that, or Wikipedia is also a really good map. They've been updating theirs as well. And so they made a land bridge from Mariupol, from their forces in the Donbas region, which are in the east, to their forces that are just north of Crimea. And then their next city is going to be going west towards a city called Odessa, which is on the Black Sea, which is the next large city in the south that they need to take. And then after that, they've essentially taken all of the land in the Black Sea. So essentially, Ukraine would be landlocked at that point. So,
right.
Yeah,
so that would be a turning point, right? Because that would make it extremely difficult for Ukraine to get certain supplies and things like that.
Yeah, it would be. It actually wouldn't be too difficult, because the Black Sea is already essentially shut down. The way the Black Sea works is it is the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Strait, which are controlled by Turkey over by Istanbul. It's extremely difficult to get forces in there, and essentially the Black Sea is small enough to where any missile system could just completely take out a strike. So there's no way any U.S. or vessel is going to be able to go into the Black Sea, because Russia would be able to shoot them down. And so most of the stuff that is coming through and supplying Ukraine has been going through Kyiv or going through Romania, since those are both NATO ally or NATO members, excuse me. Now that's going to be more classified, so I don't know exactly where the routes that U.S. or NATO is supplying Ukraine, but it's going to be mostly through land. So thankfully, as long as Russia does not control the most eastern half or the most western half of Ukraine, then we are still able to supply their forces. But it does seem like Russia is going to be able to try to take that out by taking the entire country. So but Russia wants to be able to take the entire coast of Ukraine, because Russia very much relies heavily on naval assets, whereas Ukraine does not as well. So this is more of a win for Russia than it is a loss for Ukraine if they take that area. Right. But Odessa is still a very large naval base for Ukraine. So all of their naval assets are going to be essentially destroyed. So in the future, we're not ever going to be able to use naval assets to help Ukraine unless we do like a full, amphibious landing invasion of Russia, which is obviously not going to happen. So.
Yeah. So I mean, I kind of promised myself I wouldn't ask you to make predictions, because as an economist, people always want it from me, and it's like I literally don't know what's going to happen. So let me phrase this carefully. Could you explore, some of the possibilities for how this conflict could go on? So, for example, things like protracted occupation. The splitting of the country. I mean, how do you think, how likely do you think these things might be? What do you think would have to happen for each of them to play out? That's a convoluted way of saying, can you make a prediction without saying?
Right. So yeah, as like you said, predictions are very hard. In intelligence, a lot of times people are like, oh, you're an intelligence analyst, you have top secret clearance. What's going to happen? Well, in intelligence, it's very, very easy for me to say what already has happened. I can look at my intelligence stuff and say, okay, they did this. It's a lot harder for me to make predictions, like you mentioned. So, I will go over some of the possibilities. So, what is, I guess, the most likely, in my opinion, is that Russia takes the entire country of Ukraine, and so that means A, Russian forces are going to have to occupy the region, and B, there is going to be a new government that is going to have to be instituted and is going to be a government that is either voted in, which is probably just going to be a sham vote, or just going to be straight up instituted by Russia. Similar to how the US did in Iraq or Afghanistan, we had a small intermittent period where we were trying to get elections ready. And so we just had somebody run the country in the meantime. And so Russia will probably do something like that, where they have someone run over the country, or run the country. The problem with that is that that is going to be I cannot stress enough how terrible of an insurgency that is going to be for Russia. If people thought that Afghanistan was difficult or Iraq was difficult, think of that times 20. Because one, was Iraq was a much more fractured military. So there were people in the military that did, or there were people who were doing insurgency in Iraq that did have a military experience, where in Afghanistan they didn't really. But it was still a fractured military and they didn't have command. In Ukraine, you were going to have a somewhat functional military running an insurgency. And you also have the United States as your ally, which, as everybody knows, the United States is very, very much understanding of what it takes to have a good insurgency, because we dealt with two for over 20 years. So we have a very good understanding of exactly what had been a pain in our ass and what's going to be a pain in Russia's ass, right? And so not only that, but a big thing, if people remember, in Afghanistan was that the Taliban was always able to just operate on the eastern side of Afghanistan. And then whenever we would take out forces, they would just go back between the border of Pakistan and then go resupply. Now, that was not an official resupply. The Pakistani government never officially gave help to the Taliban, and it was mostly just different tribes that were giving them help. But in Ukraine, it is going to be times 10. You have 4 NATO countries that are bordered with Ukraine. So you're essentially going to be plugged in. As long as there is any land that is operating in Ukraine, there's always going to be an area where we can either supply aircraft, or we can supply javelins, or we can supply, you'll see on Twitter, there's literally just random civilians making ballistic vests. All of that stuff is going to be easily supplied. And if you have an insurgency that is always having supplies, that is extremely difficult to take out, because you're never going to be able to crush the spirit of the insurgency if those groups are always able to supply it and are always making wins. And so for Russia, I cannot imagine a situation in which Russia takes the country and is able to crush a Ukrainian insurgency and then is just able to institute a government. That's what they want to do. That's what their goal is, to take over the country, institute a government that is more aligned with Russia, and then eventually pull out forces and then just let the country, run its course. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think that's a far cry from a possibility. What I think is most likely, besides that, if Russia does not take the area, I think another likely situation is that Russia is just physically not able to do the campaign anymore. That they've had so many logistical problems. They have spent so much money. The sanctions are just far too much on their country, although I think that's going to have less of an impact. But we can get into that later. But essentially, they're just going to. It does not matter how much Vladimir Putin wants this. It's just you can't. We do not have enough. We do not have enough forces. Like, it's a physical impossibility. In that situation, I honestly don't know what is going to happen, because Vladimir Putin is a very interesting person, but he's also someone who does not, which, no surprise, most countries don't like being seen as weak, especially, least of all, authoritarian countries, of somebody who's very, known as a strongman person. And so if Russia does not come out of this with somewhat of a win, it's going to be very difficult for Vladimir Putin to agree on terms of that. And so I'm not 100% sure what he is considering almost like his red line of like, okay, these are extra things that I want, maybe like a more aligned government in Ukraine or more land or something. But these are the things that I need, like I need Ukraine not to join NATO or something like that. And so I don't know what Vladimir Putin's things. I don't know what he exactly wants and what he is unwilling to give up. But it's likely going to get to a position where he has to figure out, okay, when are you going to cut your losses here? Unfortunately, countries don't you really cut their losses for a very, very long time. And so if it's going to be a situation where it's an insurgency, it could last years, honestly, but I don't even know at this point because those are so many, it's so difficult to predict on that. And also, obviously, at the classified level, maybe I'd be able to make more predictions, but most diplomatic talks between countries are going to be at the classified level. So I don't know what United States, or I can't speak to what the United States might be talking to another country or what they're talking about to Russia, because obviously that stuff is more classified. So it is possible that they might be talking in peace talks or something like that. And I think another possibility is, I think the least likely possibility is that Russia just kind of quits now. I did read something about some type of peace deal that they could possibly institute that, maybe it was Ukraine, or Ukraine says, okay, you can have Crimea and the Donbas region, and then we just go and do whatever we want. I don't think that's going to be likely either, because, Russia does not want a country, specifically Ukraine, to be aligned to the West, and that's going to be their ultimate goal. So anything that doesn't result in a Ukraine that is more aligned with Russia is going to be considered as a loss to Vladimir Putin. And so, I think militarily it's kind of difficult because it is 100% possible that Russia just makes like a complete 180 and they're able to fix a lot of their logistical issues and they are able to have more successes on the battlefield. But from the insurgency part, I just cannot imagine a situation in which Russia, or honestly any country, I don't think any country in the world would ever be able to outlast an insurgency on the level that Ukraine is going to be able to do, because Ukrainians have had a long history of fighting, Russia, and they have also had as you've seen on Twitter, they are very much ready for a fight, and so this is going to be a very highly motivated insurgency, a very highly resupplied insurgency, and an insurgency that has very good command and control of its forces, which is, unseen in history. Usually insurgencies are very, they're either terrorist groups or they are some small like ragtag groups that are kind of, able to poke the bear a little bit. But this is going to be a lot different.
Yeah, well, okay, so I was going to ask you, is there any precedent for that level of insurgency in history? But like, your answer is no. It's literally
no,
nothing like it. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Okay. So yeah. I mean, one thing that you alluded to earlier, which we haven't really spoken about, was like the West's response to Russia. So, I mean, what do you think of the response so far? Would you sort of, what would you say has been positive about it, and what would you change?
Yeah, so I think right now, and I'm speaking most. I don't know how many people are. I know you're from Britain. I don't know how many other people are from Europe, and so I'm from America, so I can mostly speak to the American response. But I've also been paying attention to the EU and NATO one. But I think right now, the Biden administration and NATO and EU's response has been, I don't want to say like perfect or flawless or anything, but there are very few things that I would say that they got wrong or aren't doing that I wouldn't want to be doing right now. So what their strategy mostly is to have I alluded to it earlier, that Putin bet on a more fractured NATO, in the sense of not a lot of countries were going to be agreeing on what strategy they want. He kind of bet that some countries would not want to be giving up Russian oil and gas. Some countries would be. And so they wouldn't have a unified response. They'd mostly be fighting amongst themselves rather than paying attention to what they should be, which is pushing back on Putin. That turned out to be very much wrong. Almost every single NATO and EU country has essentially agreed on three things: a strong sanctions against Russia, no more oil and gas, and sending as many military assets without actually putting boots on the ground as possible. So right now, though, that is going to be the main strategy. Is we send the United States right now is talking to Poland about sending some of the fighter aircraft over to Ukraine to help Ukraine's air force. Obviously, the sanctions are extremely harsh and are only increasing. Actually, I think they've still been talking about oil and gas sanction as well, and then sanctioning some of the oligarchs in Russia. And then the other thing of sending in military assets, or Germany has also talked about they're not going to be accepting Russian gas in the future, which is, I mean, if you would have asked me months in advance if Germany would have been doing that, I would have said, no, that's ridiculous. They're obviously going to try to keep the Russian Russian oil and gas. They're just going to try to temporarily do it now. But it seems like they've been doing a complete 180, essentially. And so one thing that I compare this to is almost like, it does seem like this is almost like the EU or NATO's 9/11 in a way, because for some of the younger audience, but they might not remember, but some of the older audience, especially in America, George Bush was very much an isolationist. And obviously when 9/11 happened, he completely did a 180 on that. It kind of very emotionally spoke to him. And, for better or worse, he turned into somebody who was much more willing to use his military forces. And so I think for NATO and EU, it's going to be very similar, where they were more willing to have a better relationship with Russia. And it looked like for them it kind of backfired. And I think they're going to try to take a 180 position on that and be more hawkish on Russia. But I think the position right now is extremely, I think it's been going extremely well. The most important thing is to have a unified group. I know a lot of different people are saying, oh, America should do a no-fly zone or something like that. But the problem is that you are essentially, if you imagine a bunch of people in a giant hula hoop, that is what you're working with. And as long as everybody stays in the hoop, you guys are far more safe and you guys are far stronger together. If one country goes out and does its own thing, then you now have a bunch of people who are not fighting Russia, but trying to fight each other, saying, okay, wait, no, you can't do that. Okay, no, wait, I have to do this. And it's just not going to be good. And it's going to shift the strategic messaging away from, hey, Russia is doing something bad and NATO and EU are pushing against it, to, okay, now NATO and EU don't even know what they're doing anymore. And some lone gun is trying to go in there and start World War III or something, right? And so the response from the Biden administration, I think, has been really amazing. And it's been really smart, because a lot of times in the past, which Russia has talked about this, is that the United States has been the world leader, like a liberal hegemonic power or whatever. And so a lot of countries see the United States as a leader. And so the United States does something first and then everybody follows. But on this response, we have kind of done the opposite, where behind the scenes, yes, the United States is being more of a leader, but the United States has not come out first with something. SWIFT, those were other, Biden specifically said, no, we're not ready to do that unless our European partners are. And then the next day, the European partners were the ones that said that they're coming out with SWIFT, and the United States followed. Or with Russian oil and gas, other European partners are kind of taking the lead. So the strategic messaging with the Biden administration has very much been, we don't want to make it seem like this is just some fight between the United States and Russia, and we're using Europe as a battleground, and we're just using Ukraine, you're just walking over dead Ukrainians, right? We want to see this as this is Europe fighting for its defense. This is Europe. This is a war, not a war, but this is a battle between Europe and Russia, and the United States is helping. The United States doesn't want to be seen as some giant power that is just telling people what to do, because that goes into Putin's messaging of, okay, America's just using you guys, right? That's what Putin wants to say, is that America is just using these different countries to do its own type of, imperialism or whatever his argument is, which his arguments kind of have shifted, which you can talk about that as well. But that's going to be the most response, is that you have a unified European response through the EU or through NATO, and you have a Euro-focused response where the United States is not seen as the power that is telling everybody what to do, essentially, and forcing people into giving up their gas that they might not want to do. You want to see as, okay, Germany was the one who said, which it actually is true. Germany was the one who said that they didn't want Russian oil and gas anymore. That wasn't America, strong arming them into that position or something. And so I think the messaging has been really good on our side. And I also think I mean, Biden, initially said he was not sending in Russian or was not sending in ground assets, which I think is an amazing idea, because he always wants to push against the idea that this is just some, Vladimir Putin's going to be saying, okay, this is America trying to start a war or something. But if you at every corner you say, we are not sending in U.S. forces, we are not sending in U.S. forces, it's going to be very difficult for Putin to make that argument when, you're saying, well, he has said like 50 times he's not sending in forces. So how could you say this is them trying to start World War III or something, which I think, sending in forces would be a bad idea anyway. Yeah. But, so I think the response has been really good, having a unified EU and NATO, having strong sanctions, and being able to do pretty, as much as possible without sending in forces has been really good. And then also, the US's more backseat response, at least publicly, more of a backseat response, I think has been a really good idea as well, because a lot of what happens in warfare is that you have to push against what's called strategic messaging. And it's essentially, a country's ability to put out a strategy of, this is what we think is happening. This is what, this is our response to that. If you'll remember, before this happened, Russia was trying to essentially do a false flag operation where they were saying, like, they made up this thing about, okay, there were Ukrainians killing Russian troops, so we're going to go in. But U.S. intelligence was able to put that out and say, hey, look what we're doing. And so I think this has been a really good response from them as well, of being able to show the intelligence, even though it's classified and it might hurt our ability to do intelligence in the future. It was 100% worth it to show, hey, Russia is doing this. And it is extremely difficult for Vladimir Putin to do what he had to do, which was essentially go into a war with a on the spot made up reasoning, which is like, just like a generally alluding to Nazis in Ukraine or something like that, which is not as good of a response as what he originally wanted, which was, Russia and Ukraine have been having tensions, and then Ukraine just went in and was super, crazy, and they just started killing Russians, and we just had to. That's what his response wanted to be of, okay, we had to do this, we had no choice. And then, the U.S. intelligence kind of showed that was not true. And so, yeah, I think generally the response has been really good.
Thank you. You said a lot of interesting things there. Let me just address chat for a second. So, by the way, we have over 400 views, which is not usual for my live streams. Yeah, I know. So, can chat? I know this is one of the most distressing and polarizing situations going on at the moment, but let's just keep the rape analogies and telling people that their families should die to a minimum. Let's try to not to contribute to the overwhelming amount of hatred that there is in this debate. But okay, so you said a lot of interesting things there that I want to pick up on. One in particular was that you said that NATO could be more hawkish in the future. Now, what would that look like? And perhaps you could give a little bit of a background on what NATO kind of is and isn't while you answer that.
Yeah. So for those, I'll just assume that everyone, doesn't have like a good understanding of stuff. So I don't want to talk over stuff. So when somebody says something is hawkish, usually they mean not like more aggressive, but I guess more aggressive is a good analogy. So like if I'm hawkish on Russia, that means I don't want to have better relations with them. I'm thinking of them as being more aggressive, and I'm going to be more strongly defensive. Whereas the opposite would be dovish. And so it's going to be more of, okay, I want better relations with them. I'm not going to, do something with my military or something like that. And so, NATO is, so a brief history on NATO. After World War II, the Cold War kind of started. And so we created what is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a group of about, I think there were like 15 original signatures. It's essentially a defense pact which says if you invade one of these countries, it's essentially the same. It is legally the same as you invading another country. So if Russia was to invade Norway, which they share a small border up in the north, that would be essentially that would be legally the same as if the United States was invading mainland United States or mainland France. And so the Defense Pact has been able to prevent any, it was specifically a response, or not response to the Warsaw Pact, but it's specifically a response to the Cold War. So it is more Russian centric, but it has been able to prevent Russia from ever deciding they might invade one small country. And so it is good for small countries, because countries that don't have that ability, like the Baltic states is a good example of pushing back against Russian forces, because obviously Estonia, it does not have a bigger military than Russia. Yeah. And so it's been good for them, and then it's also been good for the United States, because the United States gets to have like a leadership position. They get to be a liberal hegemonic power, and then countries are more of like a mutually beneficial relationship of United States gets more power, and other countries get to be essentially under a security blanket of an almost impenetrable wall, because Russia would never want to go to war with the United States. It'd be the end of the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so yeah, that's a little. So right now, I think there's about 30 countries that are in NATO. A lot of the talk about NATO right now is a lot of the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, specifically the Baltic states, Poland, or used to be part of the Warsaw Pact as well, are also part of NATO. And Ukraine was trying to join NATO as well. So there is a lot of talk of whether NATO is being too aggressive or something, which I guess we can get into that a little bit later. But I'm sorry, your original question on NATO was what was it again?
Sorry, that was a good rundown of NATO. But
I wasn't sure if there's anything else.
The history. The question was, what would NATO being more hawkish in the future look like?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So in the last few years, more specifically Germany, but a lot of other countries have relied on Russian oil and gas for their energy, because there is a lot of it in Russia. And so you get it really cheaply, and it's a really easy, if Germany's right there, they might as well get gas to the closest place, right? And so a lot of, after the Cold War, the United States didn't really have any giant power that was pushing against them. The United States was kind of like the most powerful country in the world at that point. The Cold War was over. There wasn't anything to fight against. And so a lot of people thought that this was kind of the end of, actually there's literally an article called The End of History, which a lot of people were very much interestingly enthusiastic about the end of the Cold War, and they thought it was kind of like the beginning of world peace, which unfortunately didn't turn out to be true. But yeah, so when we say NATO is going to be more hawkish, NATO is going to be doing a 180 on its position of increased relations with Russia, increased reliance on energy from Russia. And so, like I mentioned, Germany said that they specifically are going to be not taking Russian oil and gas in the future at all, which is that's just crazy. I don't know how they're going to be able to do that. I'm not an energy person, so maybe they are going to be able to do that, but that's going to be a very difficult strategy to implement. But yeah, Germany and NATO, they're not going to be able to have these increased relations with Russia. For the last 20 years, we have been trying to do kind of a reset on our relations with Russia. The Cold War was over. There was really no reason for us to be fighting anymore. And so what we wanted to have was a Russia that is more aligned. And in fact, in the 90s, there were even talks of Russia joining NATO, which is a pretty crazy thing to think about now. But, so that's going to be something that is not going to be happening in the future, because people are always going to be able to say, okay, the last time we tried to increase relations with Russia, they invaded a country and it was kind of difficult for us to have a response for. So I think it's going to be a lot of obviously decreased economic relations, which I think is probably going to take a while. It's going to be decoupling countries' energy from Russia, decoupling their diplomatic relations from Russia, and it's going to be a lot of I don't want to say necessarily hostilities, but it's going to be, more forces are going to be pushed on the border, especially if you're bordered with Russia. Germany just announced that this year specifically, they just doubled their defense budget because a lot of different countries in NATO don't have amazing militaries because they've always been able to rely on the United States military ability. But it looks like that's going to be kind of shifting, and that each country is going to have to be able to, they're going to have to contend with the problem of, okay, what if I get invaded? I can't just rely on the U.S. to come here. I have to be able to defend myself in some way.
Yeah, the German
So
shift was remarkable, wasn't it? Because obviously for
it was.
historical reasons, Germany's been reluctant to expand its defense budget.
Yeah, it is. When Schultz came in, because Angela Merkel was very much somebody who was pro increasing relations with Russia, especially in the oil and gas sector, and she was a lot more dovish on Russia. And so when the new government came in, I was under the impression that they were going to be a lot more hawkish. They kind of alluded to that in some of their speeches in the beginning, and it was kind of weird for me to see, like, okay, Germany is not. They don't want to send in any military assets. They are not willing to do a lot of the stuff, which I understand. There's more domestic issues in that. So I'm not from Germany, so I can't speak to that. But it does, after the invasion, it does seem like they went, holy shit, I did not really think that was going to happen. Okay, I'm completely, I was wrong. And they're doing a complete 180, which is just insane, because if you'll remember back to some of the talks before Russia was invading, back when people were debating on whether it was going to happen or not, Germany was always the one kind of, not outlier, but it was the country that was saying, okay, hey, I don't really think this is going to happen. Maybe we should be more easy on them. I still want to have increased relations with Russia. And they're just completely, I mean, they're not even a problem anymore, in the sense of, whenever we do sanctions, we don't have to really take into consideration if Germany is not going to want to do the sanctions anymore, because they seem to be the ones pushing on some of the harsher sanctions. No, I don't even know if there's any other country that said that they are completely decoupling their energy department from Russia. So, yeah, at the beginning of, so when I was doing intel, so now that this is kind of out of the bag, I can speak to some of the stuff that was maybe more classified at the beginning, not specifics, but at the beginning, a few months ago, earlier, like around August time, was when we were kind of looking at the intel of, okay, hey, it looks like Russia's moving their forces around in a really weird way. Is it possible that they might invade? And so a lot of the countries that were saying that on the intel side that no, it's probably not, were also countries that were very reliant on oil and gas. So it seemed like a lot of the countries that were saying that, okay, it's probably not going to happen, were countries that really did not want it to happen. And so I think that a big thing with Germany is that they kind of have to contend with the issue of, like, wow, we thought this was not going to happen, and then it did. So what is, they need to go back, and they are themselves, right? Is figure out where they went wrong, what they specifically got wrong, and what policy issues are they going to be switching up. So that goes back to the defense stuff of, Germany's foreign policy was more aligned around increasing relations with Russia, having a multilateral cooperative relationship with Russia, and now they're going to be switching to, we need to have a better defense against Russia. We need to not ever be in a position to where Russia can tell us what to do, and that's going to be the defense stuff around is going to be the specifics. So the specifics of the defense are doubling their budget for this year, and I'll for the doubling of the budget, that's not going to be every single year. That's just for this year specifically. And I think they said they were going to increase their budget by around 30% year to year. So just this year, they've increased their budget, or they've doubled their budget, but it's not going to be a doubling of a military budget for forever, because that would be extremely expensive. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So I think one thing that I'd like to talk about, and it's coming up in chat a lot, is the perspective of Putin, or perhaps more generally Russia or the Russian government, whatever you want to call it. Now, what you're saying is a situation, you're describing a situation where Russia, the European countries, and perhaps the US have tried to reach out to Russia for a while and be dovish, right, as opposed to hawkish. as you defined it. Now that clearly isn't Putin's perspective, right, on how he and Russia have been treated. He sees NATO as and the US as well as encircling him, right? I mean, I know that there's a lot of talk in some circles about how NATO originally agreed it wouldn't expand eastwards, but now it has, right? And
Right.
so, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so I guess we can jump into. So there's two things to talk about: the NATO expansion and then Vladimir Putin specifically. Well, I guess I'll start with the NATO expansion. So it is a very it is kind of a heated debate. Well, I don't know if it's heated, but there are a lot of people that truly believe that NATO did mention that we wouldn't. The famous line from the State Department official or the Secretary of Defense, James Baker, who from George W. Bush's administration is not not 1 inch, essentially alluding to NATO expanding. But if you look at the actual transcripts, it's not really talking about NATO. It's specifically talking about NATO's military assets in Germany. We're not going to move from West Germany to East Germany, which are true. In East Germany does not have any NATO military assets in the country, so it does look like we've agreed to that. But I'm not going to act like that's not a hotly debated topic. There are plenty of foreign policy people who do believe that NATO had mentioned that. Some people who don't. So
I know your namesake, or half of your namesake, Noam Chomsky, takes that view from what I've seen.
Yes, yeah, and I'll just mention it one more time. Now, there's a lot of people who are in there. I'm not a Henry Kissinger fan. I'm not a Noam Chomsky fan. I know we talked about it at the beginning when there were less people in here. I just want to make sure.
No, people keep asking who is Noam Kissinger as well.
Yeah,
so, yeah,
yeah. I'm not. It's a joke that I thought everybody would get, but I guess I'm not as good at sarcasm as I thought I was. Yeah. So Noam Chomsky, from my understanding, does take that position. But the problem with So even if we assume that's true, even if the George W. Bush administration in the 90s did tell the new Russian government that yes, NATO would not move 1 inch, it was never signed into agreement. So there is no legally binding document that says NATO cannot move. And I'd also point out that that was a conversation between one member of NATO, and one single member is not able to make policy on NATO. So even if the United States did say NATO would not move, it's not up to the United States to decide that. It is up to the way that NATO works is that you have to have a unanimous consent of policies. So when you're adding a new member, every NATO member has to agree to it. When you're doing a new policy, every NATO member has to agree to it. So even if that was true, it was never signed. There was never like any agreement that was written up. It was just like one mention of it in a talk with them. So I think that Putin is kind of mentioning that a lot more because that seems like a better argument that he can run with, but he doesn't really mention the legal binding agreement that Russia agreed to, which was not to invade Ukraine once they gave up their nuclear weapons. So yeah, I think that's more of just an argument from Putin's side that he believes that NATO is kind of like this aggressive pact. But so I guess it's a good segue into Vladimir Putin himself. So Vladimir Putin. So for people who don't know, Vladimir Putin, he used to be in the KGB whenever he was a lot younger. He used to actually specifically worked in East Germany. So he which is kind of why him and Merkel were pretty good friends because they both spoke German, and Angela Merkel was from East Germany. So they kind of had that personal relationship because they both have that experience. But he was somebody who was very much a believer that and he's mentioned this multiple times, is that the worst diplomat or the worst foreign policy foreign relations event in the 21st century was the fall of the Soviet Union, or the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union, was that the Soviet Union never should have dissoluted. They never should have, in his eyes, given up to essentially the United States and NATO. In Vladimir Putin's eyes, USSR gave up the fight and they were weak and they lost. And, he wants to have a situation in which we can go back to that and redo the fight, essentially. And there was actually I was just recently listening to a talk about somebody talking about this, and there was a time, I don't know the specific city, but Vladimir Putin was in East Germany, and he was a KGB agent there, and he was a little bit higher up. So I believe there was a protest that was happening. He wanted to be able to send in the military, and he wanted to be able to push the protesters back or kill them, or whatever it took to get rid of them, essentially. And the response from Moscow was, "We are not going to send in forces in East Germany right now." And the specific line was, "Moscow, we are only going to do what Moscow tells us, and right now Moscow is silent." And that line, "Moscow is silent," has very much resonated in Vladimir Putin, of his feelings of how USSR and how Russia has been treating NATO, is that they've been silent on NATO, they've been weak on NATO, and they have not been doing what is necessary for the Russian people. And so Vladimir Putin's essentially strategic goal is to create a similar world order that we had in the Cold War, where you had a Soviet bloc world order, and then you had a liberal US hegemonic world order, where the US was the leader of one and the Soviet Union was the leader of the other. And so the way that you're going to do that, though, unfortunately, I think people overestimate Vladimir Putin's intellect, because he's not really good at doing this. But the way you need to do that is you need to have countries that are agree to that. In the United States liberal world order, we had NATO. And so countries agreed to be a part of that. They benefited from it. They got, a better economy or whatever, because it's coupled with the United States. And then on the Soviet Union side, it was very similar. Warsaw Pact countries benefited from being part of the Warsaw Pact and stuff like that. And so from the Soviet Union side, or from the Russian side, it is kind of the opposite, is that Russian aggression, which is something, like I mentioned, is something that Vladimir Putin thought that the Soviet Union was not doing. And so that's what he wants to do, is be more aggressive, is kind of moved countries towards NATO. The Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, have, back in 2000, I believe 2004 was when they joined, were very afraid of Russian aggression, and that's kind of the reason that they joined NATO. So his strategy of, being aggressive towards countries to get them to go away from NATO has essentially backfired, because obviously Ukraine was trying to join NATO, Finland and Sweden are talking about joining NATO as well.
Yeah.
And Georgia in 2008 was also talking about, Georgia and Ukraine in 2008 were both talking about joining NATO, and Georgia was invaded after that as well. And so from Vladimir Putin's side, his goal is to create a world order that is having one of the great powers, which in his eyes is Russia, going back to essentially a Cold War mindset of, we have competing dual bipolar hegemonic groups that are competing for power, and essentially go back to what the Cold War was and say, hey, we didn't lose, we need to go back, we need to redo this fight, let's go for round two or something like that. And so thankfully for Russia, that has not worked out. But the downside is that when that doesn't work out for Vladimir Putin, he starts to get a lot more aggressive and a lot more willing to do things that are pretty belligerent, like invade Ukraine, which is, something that is, I can't imagine why anybody advised him to do that, because it doesn't seem to be working out very well. So yeah, that's the
that's
general understanding of what he wants.
Yeah, that's a really good history. I wasn't aware of some of that personal history of Putin. One of the things that kind of shocks me, I have anarchist tendencies. I'm what I have what James Scott would call the anarchist squint. I think we should all have the anarchist point of view at heart, even if we don't fully subscribe to anarchism. So what that means in practice is being skeptical of state aggression, right, and being in favor of self-determination. So what really surprises me, especially when people from the left do it, who, are generally pro-democracy and pro-self-determination, at least in theory, is to kind of take the ruler's point of view of history, and see things from Putin's point of view. And I've seen this quite a lot, and I've actually seen it not just on the internet where you get all sorts, but I've seen people do it in real life, where they're sort of saying, oh well, Ukraine used to be a part of Russia, other countries used to be a
Right.
part of Russia, and therefore somehow that justifies the invasion. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me, right? Because obviously, everywhere used to be a part of everywhere, and it
Right.
goes back a very long time. Yeah.
Yeah. So if anybody is seen on Twitter or a lot of places, a very famous I guess it was not a speech, more of like a lecture, was by John Mearsheimer, who is a realist international relations thinker. So in international relations theory, there's essentially three main groups of international relations of realism, liberalism, and constructivism. We don't have to get into the specifics of all those, but he is a realist thinker who is if a very good way to explain it is that Henry Kissinger was also a realist thinker. So John Mearsheimer is a realist. So if that tells you that it's not really realism is essentially, at least in my opinion, very much an imperialist form uh, of international relations, of thinking that okay, right makes right is a big thing in realism. Of okay, these are strong powers, they have security issues. In John Mearsheimer's eyes, Russia has a legitimate security issue to decide that Ukraine should not be setting its own destiny, because Russia wants to make sure that there are essentially a buffer zone in between his country. And, the idea that we should just be able to use countries as buffer zones is kind of, that's very much like an imperialist type thing, right? Is that Russia gets to decide the fate of Ukraine because Russia's just bigger, and that's just the way the world works. And so there's a there's a famous lecture by him. There's a couple famous lectures. He's a very famous and respected realist thinker. I just very much disagree with him. But and so yeah, like you mentioned, is that NATO is a defensive pact. Even if you're not a fan of NATO, which that's fine. NATO is obviously not perfect, but NATO provides the ability for smaller countries to be able to set their own destiny to a certain extent. And so even if we accept the idea, even if we, which I don't really agree with it, even if we accept the idea that Russia has legitimate security concern to not want Ukraine to join NATO, Ukraine has a much more serious concern of not wanting to be invaded by Russia, because Ukraine does not pose as near close to the threat that Russia does to Ukraine. And so Ukraine has been invaded essentially for the third time in the last, 15 years of Russia from Russia. And so them wanting to join NATO is extremely understandable. And if the people of Ukraine, which it does look like they do, if the people of Ukraine want to join the EU and they want to be part of the West, then, or if they want to join NATO, then that's 100% fine. That's up to them. And I would say that NATO is far less, because if we look back to the Warsaw Pact was USSR's policy was always that they could intervene for essentially their version of state socialism, right? And so if a country was in the Warsaw Pact and they were unwilling to adopt state socialism, the USSR reserved the right to go in and protect socialism. When you look at NATO, there is a diverse group of countries that are, as far as some countries like which you're European, so you probably know more about this than I do, but you obviously have like the Labour Party in United Kingdom, which is more socialist aligned, versus like if we're looking specifically in the 80s, different countries in NATO which were more socialist aligned were very much different than Ronald Reagan's more neoliberal conservative type government. But that didn't really matter, because NATO was a defensive group. It wasn't a way for the United States to enact neoliberalism or conservatism on different countries. It was a way for countries to not be, invaded, essentially. And if Britain or France or somebody else wanted to enact a socialist government, that was fine, as long as it wasn't a socialist government that was trying to, align with the Soviet Union, because you don't want an aligned Soviet Union country in NATO, because then that deteriorates the security of NATO. So yeah, I very much agree. In fact, Vosh is kind of, if you see on Twitter, Vosh is very much pushing towards this I think he even made like a flag of like an anarchist NATO flag and like anarchist NATOism or something like that. So
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I remember
yeah,
that now. Anarcho-NATOism or something. Yeah.
anarcho NATOism or something like that. So I am like personally I'm a liberal, so I'm not really like a leftist, but
Mm.
I think it's very much pretty cool to see a lot of leftist people that are pushing for NATO to see as somebody who a country that can protect countries that want to move towards whatever economic means that they decide they can do without being invaded. I want Estonia. If Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania decide that they want to move towards a social democracy or if they want to move towards socialism, that's 100% great. I don't want another country to be able to go in there and tell them no because Russia or the United States or any country should not have the ability to decide that level of sovereignty. Now, in the international arena, all countries cede some level of sovereignty to other countries because you have to abide by international rules and international law and stuff like that. But as far as it goes, and obviously you can't make a government that is violating human rights. You can't make a government that is, killing or creating a genocide. That's a level of sovereignty that we're not going to respect. But as far as it goes of I want to create a more Labor Party socialist movement or something like that, that's 100% fine. And so I think it is pretty cool that a lot of people are kind of saying like, hey, it does really seem like NATO is a group that can provide this level of security and safety for different countries.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so some people you'll be pleased to know people are finding your name funny, by the way, in case you haven't seen in the chat.
Yeah. If you guys go on my Twitter, just check on my Twitter. It says not a Noam Kissinger fan or not a Henry Kissinger fan, but
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, so one of the things I guess I tend to buy a lot of the support. Like I agree with Vorsh, for example, on this issue. A lot of the support for Ukraine. I feel like it's been pretty good, pretty unanimous.
Yeah.
People have been quite humanist, and I think less so than in the past. People have been kind of willing to justify Russia's actions. I don't know if it's just how I've cultivated my feed, but it's what I've found. Now, one thing that I think people will say, and there's a bit of it in chat, is they'll talk about some of the aggression in the Middle East, right? So while I mean, there's different versions of this argument. There's kind of the version that says, well, Russia invading Ukraine is kind of similar to the US and allies invading Iraq. And there's also the point that kind of NATO were directly involved in places like Libya. So
Right.
what do you say to those arguments?
So I think that when we look at how states should act, there are kind of two different things. You can say, okay, states, like if I approach a way a state should act, there are things that a state are never allowed to do. There is no circumstance for example, in which a genocide is ever something we should do. So like no matter what the circumstance is, genocide, bad, right? And there are other ways states that act that are 100% dependent on the circumstances. So invading a country is something that, depending on the circumstances, might be good, it might be bad. And so right now we're talking about invading a country and we're comparing it to Iraq, or we're comparing it to Libya, which wasn't really invasion, but it was a no-fly zone, which people are talking about NATO doing as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so Russia essentially, in my opinion, and I think most people's opinion, has zero legitimate claim to invading Ukraine. There was no threat from Russia, or there was no threat from Ukraine. Ukraine was never trying to invade Russia. They were just essentially trying to have a government that was not aligned with Putin, which is a threat to Vladimir Putin's power, but not to the Russian people. And so that would be an example of an action that can be justified that was not, because there was no justification for invading. Now, Iraq specifically had no it's kind of a weird maybe it was a legal justification. They did have like some UN Security Councils. I think most people agree that Iraq was not a justified war. That being said, well, for one, Iraq was not a NATO escapade. Most NATO countries disagreed with it, so it was more of like a US thing. And the Bush Doctrine was very much a more realist foreign policy doctrine that did not really like international coalitions, and they did not really like the idea of, they always said that they reserve the right to do whatever they want, whether international coalition exists, which is the exact opposite of what liberalism and international theory is doing, which liberalism very much says, you need to have cooperation and you need to, create agreed upon terms and rules. But either way, even in Iraq, as unjustified as it was, Saddam Hussein was a very, very terrible person. And he was someone who did pose a threat to different countries in the Middle East. Now, unfortunately, just because somebody poses a threat doesn't mean that war is the best scenario, because obviously war did not work out great in the Middle East, because, it turned out when we removed Saddam Hussein, a bunch of terrorist organizations came about because there was a power vacuum. And so, without getting into Iraq, I think there are different levels of justification. In Libya specifically, NATO. So in Libya, Gaddafi was, during the Arab Spring, he was unfortunately killing a lot of his civilians, and there was a lot of civil unrest. And the reason NATO intervened was that there were talks of Libyan fighters that were going to be bombing civilians protesting. And so there was one specific instance that was kind of the trigger for NATO going in, which was 2 Libyan pilots were directed to go in Libya and drop bombs on different groups, that some of them were civilians, some of them were maybe more rebel groups, but they refused to do that, and they diverted to Italy, which is a NATO country, and they essentially, gave up information saying, hey, Gaddafi's trying to get his pilots to go kill civilians. So then we instituted a no-fly zone to prevent Gaddafi from. We didn't send any troops in there. We just said, okay, you can't fly aircraft over Libya. And then Gaddafi was deposed during, I guess it would be kind of a civil war. And then another civil war happened. In my opinion, I think the no-fly zone was a good idea, because there were civilians that were going to be killed, and we prevented that from happening. The problem is that when you depose a government, you have to be willing to go in there and help them reconstruct. And NATO was not willing to do that. I think a lot of that has to do with Iraq, because people were so afraid of another Iraq happening, which is understandable. But I think the best policy, in my opinion, for Libya would be NATO to impose a no-fly zone and then send in peacekeepers, because Libya already had a pretty well-functioning government. Gaddafi was a terrible person, but his government was actually pretty good at what they did. And so all you needed to do was send in a peacekeeping force that prevented a civil war from happening, because the civil war happened because the military didn't like what the Congress was doing, and the military had more power, and so they started a civil war. But if you send in an even more powerful military, the Libyan military doesn't have that example. So I think that Libya could if NATO had gone in there and done what they should have done, which is, done the no-fly zone and then kept peacekeepers there, which was the responsible thing to do, because if you make a mess, you got to clean it up. But if that had happened, I think Libya would be a similar example to Tunisia, where it was a great example of a Arab Spring country that deposed its government and created a democracy. Unfortunately, that didn't really happen. This terrible civil war happened. ISIS went in there, and obviously did terrible ISIS things. And so, luckily, it looks like Libya is starting to get a little bit better. But yeah, I think so. If we go back to whether countries have a legitimate reason, invading a country can have times where it is legitimate. I don't think that. I think most NATO interventions are essentially justified. Libya, I think, was a good example, except we should have gone in there afterwards and done the responsible thing. But some of the interventions, like in Bosnia, there was a genocide happening. In Kosovo, there was a genocide happening. And those are both examples where we did some versions of no-fly zone, and then we also sent in troops because the UN troops were being killed. So I think NATO has a pretty good record of interventions. Some people might agree with that or might not disagree. The point is that even if you do disagree with NATO interventions, you can still agree that NATO does serve a good purpose, and that it was probably good for countries that are having threat of Russian aggression because they want to decide their own future. It's probably good that they join NATO. And so I think the best response is, something maybe like more like what Vosh is doing, which is, hey, NATO has done bad things in the past, so we should make them not do bad things now, because NATO at its core is still a good functioning idea, and it is a good thing for especially smaller countries to be a part of NATO. We should just make it better, right?
Yeah.
Which, even if you disagree with that's fine. So.
No, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, chat's obviously talking about the Middle East. I think chat's kind of kicking off a bit.
Yeah.
I don't want to get sidetracked on it.
Right.
I think, but I do agree with your ultimate conclusion, because my bottom line is, I mean, the first thing is like two wrongs don't make a right. So, you know, pointing to, let's say the US war in Iraq and NATO's intervention in Libya was completely wrong, right? It doesn't necessarily, in fact, it definitely doesn't justify what Russia's doing in Ukraine. And yeah, your other point was that, you know, in the context of Eastern Europe, especially, I think, and I think I do agree with this. You have to see that Eastern European countries, you know, they're using NATO because they fear Russian aggression, and it turns out that fear is definitely justified, right?
Yeah, it surprisingly enough, Russia's strategy of every time a country is scared of Russia and and they want to join NATO, we're just going to invade them before, and that will convince other countries not to join NATO. Turns out that was not a good strategy. It just convinced even more countries to join NATO, because now Sweden and Finland are also thinking about joining NATO. And so, you know, Russia's strategy right now would essentially be, we don't want NATO on our border, and then we go from invading Ukraine to prevent them to join NATO to, okay, now Finland, which has the largest border in Europe with Russia, join. So it kind of immediately backfired. But yeah, it does seem like there is obviously a legitimate concern from countries that are wanting to go out, especially countries that are wanting to go outside of Vladimir Putin's influence. Now, there aren't really any countries anymore that are in Vladimir Putin's influence in that level, except for Belarus, that are in Europe. Most of those countries are more like near Kazakhstan or in the Georgia area or something like that. But because a lot of those countries have joined NATO, you know, Poland, the Baltics, a lot of these countries were in either the Warsaw Pact or they're directly in the Soviet Union, Romania as well. But they joined NATO and they were able to remove themselves from a more imperialist type level of intervention on their sovereignty, which I think is always a good thing, right? You want to be able to have countries set their own destiny.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one thing I did really want to talk about, we actually haven't spoken too much about economics. Now, there are there's what we mentioned, sanctions, but there's actually another thing which I think is worth talking about before that, and that's whether part of this, you know, Russia's attitude, if you like, or Putin's attitude specifically, part of it can kind of be traced back to what happened after the Soviet Union fell. So, whereas after World War II, the USA instituted the Marshall Plan, right, which basically invested a lot in Germany and in Europe, and you know, aided them in rebuilding after an extremely destructive war. They did that in after World War II, and you know, some people on the left say that it was a way of promoting American markets, which I think is probably true, but I do still think it's probably better than the alternative of leaving these countries in the dust. I'm not sure if that's quite the right expression, but anyway, moving on to Russia, what happened was a much more abrupt change to kind of free market model where, you know, an extreme free market model where there seemed to be a lot of looting, there was a lot of corruption, there were, you know, mass privatization, there was just no proper path laid out. And I mean,
oligarchs.
Yeah, and oligarchs got very rich, you know, cheap Russian state assets. They could buy cheap Russian state assets, and you know, inequality rose by quite a lot. Mortality just rose as well. Like it was a really, really huge economic shock. And there's just this argument that basically what what should have been done after the Soviet Union collapsed was to institute something similar to a Marshall Plan for Russia, and then maybe we might not find ourselves now in the situation that we did. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I'm not sure on the specifics of what had happened after. Yeah, the fall of the Soviet Union and end of the Cold War kind of, I guess, kind of broke a lot of people's brains, because pretty much everybody was like, okay, Cold War's over, NATO's gone, Soviet Union's gone, the end of war has officially happened, and those were the last two powers that are possibly going to go to war. But NATO still existed afterwards, and they became even more active because that was the first time they intervened was in the 90s. Excuse me. And the Soviet Union and the United States were still kind of, not great relations, and then they eventually deteriorated further. Yeah, specifically for the Marshall Plan, I don't know how much. Now, I'm not an economist, obviously, so I don't know how much that would have helped. It did seem like a lot of it had to do with they're more of like their political institutions and less about their economy, because they did have, I would imagine they did have a lot of economics that they could build off of. It was mostly just a Soviet model. It was not really great for that. And so, yeah, I don't know if they would necessarily need a Marshall Plan, but they would probably need some sort of, okay, we're having more inclusive institutions, we're having like a better democratic model. And so, yeah, in hindsight, it's always easy to go back, but and say, well, maybe we should have had good relations. But I do think a lot of it has to do with Vladimir Putin specific, because after Boris Yeltsin, which we had pretty good relations with Russia with Yeltsin, Vladimir Putin was the next person, and that's kind of when it had kind of deteriorated. So, Russia went from accepting that they lost the Cold War and accepting that the next path should be increasing relations with not only the United States, but with the rest of the West and Europe, and being a participating member in the West. And they even, like I mentioned earlier, they even mentioned possibly joining NATO themselves. To, okay, the Soviet Union, or the Cold War is not over. We can go back and we can do this again, and we can win this with Vladimir Putin coming in. So I know a lot of people are kind of talking about, if NATO had come up with a different strategy, or if they had dissolved after Cold War, maybe things would be different. It's definitely possible, but I think the biggest thing is honestly just Vladimir Putin himself, is that he is he really did switch turn the tides of where Russia was going to be. So yeah, I do. I think it definitely is possible that we could have had better relations, but I think if Vladimir Putin comes in, I think that no matter what happens, I think that changes it.
I suppose the question is whether the better transition would have undermined the appetite for a strongman figure among the population, with the caveat, obviously, that I know Russian democracy is
right,
very flawed to say the least, but like that's got worse over Putin as well. And I was just wondering if some of the hardship created some of the appetite, which made the population more accepting of such a figure.
Yeah, so I don't know the specifics on like Russia's domestic politics. From my understanding, Yeltsin was had pretty good relations with Russia, or he was part of Russia, with the United States and NATO. So yeah, it definitely is possible. That is even if that's not true in the past, or if that's not true in this case, there are definitely plenty of examples of countries beating another country and then embarrassing them and making them do a bunch of things, and then that country gets really pissed off and comes back and even bigger. Obviously, Germany in World War II is a good example of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's definitely possible, but I do think the biggest thing is Putin, which I'm hopefully, for the sake of the world, somehow Russia is able to get rid of Vladimir Putin, because a lot of Vladimir Putin's power comes from his ability to keep maybe a lot of oligarchs happy and keep a lot of his government officials happy. If things don't go well in this war, I don't know how he can really do that. So, I do think that I think that in a hypothetical situation, given all the stuff that we've gone through, in a hypothetical situation, if Vladimir Putin is deposed and they have new elections, 100% the West and NATO should be going in there and saying, okay, this is a reset. All of it is past us. Vladimir Putin was just as bad to the people of Russia as he was to everybody else. We need to figure out how we can have a good Russia that is part of the West. And I think that doing something like that, making sure that there are strong institutions in Russia that are able to let democracy flourish would be a really good idea. So that I think in the future, that is a really good thing for us to do, is that if Vladimir Putin's not there, we're dealing with an entire different Russia than if Vladimir Putin is there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so it's interesting that you really do think it's Putin specifically, because I guess I often shy away from, I guess, well, you might call them great man theories of history, right? Where it's about the individual. But is it not the case that, for example, and I don't really know too much about who this would be, but are there people in Putin's cabinet around Putin who would end up replacing him, who are basically just the same or maybe even worse? Do you not think that's a possibility?
Yeah, that is. So yeah, I'm not a great man theorist either necessarily, but I do think in the case of this, Putin has a lot about that. But I already mentioned that. But with Vladimir Putin, the problem is that we unfortunately really have zero idea who would take over his place, because anybody that has enough power to possibly pass Vladimir Putin is, in Vladimir Putin's eyes, a threat to Vladimir Putin's power now, right? And so we have, maybe you could say Lazarov, which is foreign minister, but Lazarov's kind of older. And so there are a few people that could maybe pass him up. And obviously, if anyone from Vladimir Putin's sphere of influence or circle comes into power, then yeah, 100%, it's not going to be a great man theory anymore. It is a group of people that have a specific idea about what Russia's place in the world is, right? Which is to recreate the Soviet Union. And but if Vladimir Putin is deposed and we have a potential, we have a completely different new elections or something like that, I think that would be a good example. But yeah, for who is going to possibly pass Vladimir Putin, the honest answer is that we just really have no idea, because Vladimir Putin would never let somebody get enough power to where it would be an obvious successor to him as well. So yeah, that theory is obviously a shot in the dark. We have no idea if that's going to happen. It looks like people in Russia mostly support the war, so that doesn't look like there's going to be some giant revolution or something that's happening in Russia to get rid of Vladimir Putin.
Is that the case, that people in Russia mostly support the war then? Is that
most of the polls that I have seen? Yeah, the polls from the beginning were definitely very in favor of the war, and it does look like right now that they still support the war. There was an interesting poll that came out a little while ago. I can't remember where it's from, but it essentially looked at different countries' view of, the question was, do you have a positive or negative view of Russia? And essentially every country had gone from, the amount of people that had a positive view of Russia went down, and the amount of people that had a negative view of Russia went up, especially in the United States and Europe. But in Russia, it essentially stayed exactly the same. I think it actually was just maybe went 1 point up of, do they view Russia or the Russian government as good or bad? And so it doesn't look like people really in Russia are taking this as a serious event or like something that's super belligerent between Vladimir Putin. It does look like it is something that they kind of support. Now, that could just have to do with propaganda. I know Twitter and Facebook were shut down in Russia. Russian state media has been pushing pretty hard for this. So, maybe if Russians had a better understanding of what was happening, they would probably change their mind, but that's obviously not necessarily the case that in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder about like social desirability bias as well in these polls, right? How reliable is the data? Do people actually think that, or are they saying it because they think they have to?
Yeah, that's true as well. And also, if you have a poll that says, what's your opinion of Russia? Or, even if you don't like what Russia's doing, you probably still have a good opinion of Russia if you're Russian. So that's no surprise there as well. But yeah, I think that it's definitely possible. I don't know how much of a hold that Russia has on that ability. From my understanding, you can still, I'm sure you can answer give a different answer to a poll in Russia. Maybe, if it was North Korea, then obviously I wouldn't trust a poll coming out of North Korea. But yeah, it's definitely it's definitely something that's going to be something we're going to have to keep our eye on in the future for Russia, is if this turns out to be the economic sanctions are insane, or if they have like a really strong hold on the people in Russia, and if this war just goes terrible, that there's no way for them to hide it. What does this look like for the future of Vladimir Putin's regime? So
yeah, I mean, that's a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit about the sanctions, right? Because I mean, I started this before we were live. I was saying, I don't really think of myself. I don't know much about foreign policy. I just sort of focus on economics. But now it seems that economics and foreign policy have become very, very linked, and perhaps even more so in this war than ever before. We've seen that, like, actually, arguably the primary response, or one of the primary responses of the West has been through these economic sanctions, right? And I think there's some talk of, speaking of the population of Russia and, their support for the war, their support for Putin, there's obviously been a lot of hardship caused to Russians. There's been, bank runs. It's looking like there might be, basic supply issues. And I was just wondering, what you think of this as, from a few perspectives. Firstly, what you think of the sanctions kind of strategically. Will they work in putting pressure on Putin? Also, what do you think of them from a humanistic perspective? Because there are some people who are saying, well, actually, this isn't really affecting Putin. It's actually just making ordinary Russians suffer, and we should stop or ameliorate the sanctions. And also, finally, which is, I guess, a bit of a wild question, a bit of a wild card. What do you think of the possibility that actually, the sanctions could get so bad that Putin would lose all support and you could see a change of government? So that's quite a lot to throw at you. So we can go through it kind of gradually.
Yeah, just before that, 1 second, I'm just going to go to the bathroom real quick.
Okay, all right, cool.
Yeah.
It's cool. It's been a while. Let me address chat for a bit. Henry Kissinger meets Noam Chomsky. Yes, he did the name as a joke. He said this a few times. He did the name as a joke, and he feels that people have misinterpreted it as him occupying a middle ground between Noam Chomsky and Henry Kissinger, which is actually not at all what he thinks. He just thought it would be funny. Also, something we haven't mentioned is that his pictures of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Clone Wars, which makes it even more multifaceted and confusing, basically. Yeah, God, there's some really interesting chat in here. There's actually not that many questions over the past 50 messages or so. But yeah, God, you guys all know quite a lot about this as well. Yeah, so sanctions only create radicals among the population. Radicals, is that radicals in the sense, first, last, first? Is that radicals in the sense of, like, the bad type of radical? Or is it radicals in the sense of people who might, like, overthrow the government?
All right, I'm back.
Yeah, chat is having... I was just scrolling through chat. There actually haven't been any direct questions recently, but they are really strongly debating everything. Can you please invite Joe Biden on to defend himself? I don't think I have quite the reach to do that. I think, yeah. So sorry. So yeah, I asked you quite a lot about economic sanctions and your view of them strategically and morally and politically.
Yeah. So I think this is a really good conversation. I'm also going to be talking to Econoboy about this sometime this month as well. So yeah, I've been studying up a little bit on the specifics as well. So when it comes to economic sanctions, I think people have more of I don't want to say flawed, but a misunderstanding about what economic sanctions, what should be the goal and what should be considered a success or failure. So in my opinion, and a lot of the opinions of people who support economic sanctions, is that every in the international field, in the international arena, in the way that states operate, every action that is bad should have a negative cost to it. It should have an increased cost to it. If I have a country that does something bad, whether it's a genocide or invades another sovereign country for no justification, I want to be able to say, okay, when that country is thinking about whether they should do something, I don't want them to be able to think, okay, well, there's probably not going to be any negatives that happen from this, right? So I'm just going to do it. I want them to be able to say, hey, if I invade this country, I'm going to have a worse economy. I'm going to have, I'm going to essentially be ostracized by the rest of the world, and there's going to be a lot of bad things that happen, right? And so the way that most people, well, not most people, the way a lot of people look at sanctions is they say, okay, country did a bad thing, or a country did something that another country didn't like, and that country, I guess we'll take the U.S. A country does something the U.S. doesn't like. U.S. institutes sanctions, and then if the sanctions are successful, that country stops doing that thing, and then they release the sanctions. But that's not really a accurate way of looking at sanctions. The better way to look at it is this country, United States, has sanctions. They put on another country for doing a bad thing, and other countries that were considering doing that bad thing do not do it as well. Because it's very rare that you can convince and strongman a country into reversing a policy, because surprisingly enough, countries really don't like looking weak. And that, especially countries that are willing to do more belligerent things like either invade or create like a nuclear program is like a big reason we have sanctions on other countries. And so a country like Russia or like North Korea that has like a very strong man type leader, they don't want to be seen as, hey, we did something, the United States told us not to, and they imposed sanctions, and so we were weak and we capitulated and we didn't get back. That's not really something we necessarily expect to happen. But what we do expect to happen is that another country that is thinking about instituting a nuclear program says absolutely not, because look at what is happening in North Korea. North Korea is a great example of a country that people think sanctions don't really work on, but they actually work really well, because there's not the amount of belligerence and the amount of ostracization that country has felt is unprecedented, which is good, because I don't ever want a country to try to make a nuclear program like that. And then I also don't want ever, there are very few countries that are ever willing to pay the costs that North Korea has. So I think that's an example of sanctions working successfully, because they add costs to a belligerent act, and then other countries that were considering doing that don't conduct that act. So a better way to look at sanctions is, I just don't want a country to do that in the first place. And I think specifically with Russia, in my opinion, personally, I think that if Vladimir Putin had understood what sanctions were actually going to be instituted on him and what negatives he was going to receive, he probably would not have invaded. But a great example, another example that people are or like an analogy people are talking a lot, is China with Taiwan, because this is very much analogous. It's a country that both Russia and China wanted to be part of their country, and people are talking about invasion. I think these sanctions right now have 100% completely deterred any chance of China invading Taiwan in the future, because China would never ever want to be in the position that Russia is in. In fact, right now they're kind of debating on whether they should even come to the rescue of Russia, because they don't want to be potentially hurting their position in the world. China has spent years decades of coupling its economy with the world economy. A big thing was when they got added to the World Trade Organization, and so they are not willing to give up all that hard work to do something. So even if the sanctions on Russia don't get Russia to reverse its position, they are still extremely successful, because they have deterred China and then any future country from doing what it's doing, unless it's willing to be, possibly the next North Korea and be completely ostracized, or I guess maybe Iran is a better example, the next Iran, and be ostracized from the rest of the country or the rest of the world. Now, there are examples of sanctions being instituted, and then they do get the reversal of policy. Iran, like I mentioned, is a really great example. We instituted sanctions, and that got them to the table on the Iran deal. They agreed to sign the Iran deal, and they stopped making nuclear weapons. Then we lifted sanctions, and then their economy was, flourishing again. Unfortunately, Donald Trump came in and surprisingly fucked it up, and now we don't have the Iran deal anymore. We're trying to get it back. But that would be a good example of sanctions happening, and it convinces another country to reverse its position in a way and come to the cooperating table. And so the next question you brought up, which was talking about, the ethics of sanctions. The really unfortunate thing about when you're dealing with states is that you're dealing with an entire state. And so there is no way for me to, or when I say me, there's no way for a state to institute costs on a state without hurting the people within that state. And so if I want to prevent Vladimir Putin from doing something, it is essentially impossible for me to not also hurt people that are under the authority of Vladimir Putin, because him and the state are one and the same. And so there's no way for me to, unless I do specific sanctions on like his yacht or something, which is probably not going to be something. I think Vladimir Putin is willing to not have a yacht anymore. And that is probably something that he's not willing to change his position on. And it's probably not something that we're willing to dissuade people like, Xi Jinping, who is not a super billionaire like Russia or like Vladimir Putin is. And so he probably is going to see that as something that, okay, I don't really care if I don't have a yacht anymore because I don't have one to begin with. And so the problem is that we already, it is definitely unfair that people have to live in a country like Russia where they have a government that is willing to do stuff that is going to hurt their economy, like invading. But it's even more unfair if we allow things like countries to just go invade one another. Because I don't ever want to live in a world where a country can just go invade somewhere simply because they don't like that the domestic politics of that country is leading them on a path to not being in their sphere of influence anymore. I think people always bring up the analogy of, like, oh, what if Canada had decided to, be in Russia's sphere of influence? Or what if Canada had decided to add missiles to Russian missiles in their backyard, even though Ukraine wasn't considering putting NATO missiles? But I think that would be, my answer to that would be, yeah, that, America wouldn't like that. But if America decided to invade Canada, they would be just as wrong as Russia is now, because Canada 100% has the ability and should have the ability to decide its own, who its allies are going to be. And so I want to institute costs just like anything else. I think the best way people should think about sanctions is the same way that we think about laws. Laws in countries or laws in the United States are not, we don't always expect the law to get people to stop reoffending, right? Because especially in the United States, people who break laws a lot, unfortunately. But what laws are going to be doing is they're going to dissuade people from breaking the law the first time. So if I say, it is illegal to murder somebody, it's probably more likely that law is going to dissuade somebody from, in the heat of the moment, murdering somebody, or somebody who is kind of on the fence about doing it from doing it. It's probably not going to dissuade a serial killer, because they are, they're always going to want to murder people. So sanctions are not going to necessarily get a country to reverse its policy, because that would be requiring that country to be publicly, essentially humiliated and feel weak, which is asking a lot. But what they are going to do is dissuade that other countries in the future from ever making that decision in the first place, which is what the end goal should be. Is that I wanted to make it so high priced for this country to go do something. I want to make it so impossibly high priced for China to invade Taiwan that they never do that. The only way I can make that high price is by doing it now on Russia, which is to show, hey, if you invade Taiwan, you're going to have all of the EU, all of NATO, the United States, you're just going to be completely ostracized, and all this work that China has done to try to be a part of the world economy is going to be essentially, thrown away just to invade an island, right?
Yeah. So, I think China's a question that a lot of people are interested in. We can get to that in a minute. Right. I get the strategic logic, and I suppose, the overarching argument is that it's about minimizing costs, and there's no situation where there aren't costs to people. So I suppose what you would say is, down the line, you're looking at a situation where sanctions now means less suffering in the future. But the humanist in me just wonders, are there elements of these sanctions? And I have to admit, I don't actually know the ins and outs of sanctions and sanction economics that well either. But Are there not? Is there nothing that we can do to try and aid the poorest Russians either simultaneously with the sanctions, or not just the poorest Russians? Sorry, the everyday Russian man or woman.
Right.
And are there any elements of the sanctions that maybe can be drawn back? While helping people a lot, while also not relieving too much pressure from Putin and not defeating their intended purpose.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to helping them, so obviously, like North Korea is an example of a country that is essentially ostracized from the world economy, but the United States and the United Nations still send aid to that country, and we still give them food because obviously we don't want to cause like a famine in that country, or at least we want to do our best to prevent a famine from happening. In Russia, I don't know the specifics on how that would work. I don't think Russia's in a position where they need to have food sent to them. I think they're mostly just their economy is going to shit, and a lot of people that had investments are not going to have those investments anymore. I don't know, since the sanctions, actually most of the sanctions have not even started yet. Is mostly just the SWIFT thing that has started. The other sanctions that were instituted were on a 30-day period, so we haven't even really seen the true consequences of some of these sanctions. But it is very difficult to decouple that, unfortunately. That is when you're in warfare, it is essentially a lot of innocent people are going to die, and so sanctions are a good example of something that is better than just war, because I'd much rather have a lot of people have worse economic situations than the United States go in there and bombing people, and then a bunch of people are physically dead, right? And so sanctions are a level below warfare that we have. But a good example of something that are where we can specifically pick and choose people who are responsible for this, or Russians that are responsible for this, or Russians that are not, was I think some politicians were trying to make the claim that, oh, we should kick every single Russian college student out. That would be a good example of something that we just should not do. There shouldn't be people in Russia that need to not be going to college in America just because they are Russian, right? And so that would be a good example of where we can, okay, if you are an oligarch's child or something like that, then yeah, you don't need to be here anymore. But if you are just some random Russian citizen, there's no reason we need to kick you out. So there are examples of times where we can try to get specifics. Most people don't know this, but most sanctions, in fact, I think like almost all, not almost all, but like a good chunk, maybe like 75% of US sanctions are on individuals, and they're not actually on countries. It's kind of rare. Iran and North Korea are usually like some of the bigger outliers where we do have, and Venezuela as well, where we do have economic sanctions, but most sanctions are on individual people, whether it's, this country's military is committing human rights violations, so we sanction the individual generals that are responsible for it. Or in Syria was a good example. We prevented al-Assad's wife, who was like very into European fashion and stuff like that. She wasn't allowed to go to Europe anymore. And we hurt some of their financial assets, which people are talking about doing that in Russia as well. And so, yeah, there are ways to do both. Yeah, there are ways to do both. The unfortunate reality is that it's very difficult to not hurt individuals. But what you want to do is make the cost bad now, so that way I never have to sanction China, because they're never going to do something like this, right? So that would be kind of an answer to your question.
I think specifically, the one of the things I've seen is that like the sanctions have been, or countries have been reluctant to target, for example, Russian oligarchs with sanctions, whereas they've been more ready to do things that are going to affect ordinary Russians, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with the oligarchs, and the problem with putting sanctions on the oligarchs is that they are very good at hiding where their money is, especially Vladimir Putin. I know a lot of people talk about putting sanctions on Vladimir Putin himself. The unfortunate part is that we don't really know where a lot of his money is at. We don't really know where he gets a lot of his money, and we don't even know his true net worth either. So as it is kind of difficult, unfortunately, to try to sanction the individual people, but it is very easy to sanction a Russian gas company like Gazprom or something like that. And so that's part of the nature of sanctions as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, someone mentioned real estate in London and New York. That's a good example. We obviously know where some of these apartments are owned by the oligarchs or yachts and stuff like that. So that would be a good example of something that we're, the United States is seizing, and British officials have as well, seizing apartments or houses by Russian oligarchs and either selling them, preventing them from getting this. So that'd be a good example of something we can do.
Yeah, yeah. So I think, one thing I just mentioned earlier that I really want to ask you about, and you talked about China a bit, but you haven't really spoken about China's position on this whole conflict, because I think, I don't know, like I said, I don't know too much about foreign policy, but I don't really know what China's position is. I don't know. I haven't seen too much on it. What do you think?
So officially, most of the stuff that China has put out is kind of like just being like, China is really actually being the most enlightened centrist in this position and just kind of fence sitting on both sides a little bit. They're more coming to the aid of Russia. They've kind of blamed this whole situation on NATO and stuff like that, which is, they are definitely agreeing to some of the positions that Russia's been pushing, that, the West is being aggressive and that's why Russia's invading. But they also surprisingly came out and said that Ukraine does have a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity, and they also respect that too. So it does look like they are not really approving of this whole situation that Russia has conducted. That they do believe this was a bad idea, and that they're not willing to take the fall for Russia because they made, in their opinion, a stupid choice. The next question, so that's most of the diplomatic messaging, like what is China doing? They also abstained in the UN vote to say that Russia was, doing something bad in Ukraine. The next question is China willing to essentially come to the economic rescue of Russia? Are they willing to increase their economics and their trade relations with Russia in order to counterbalance the US and EU sanctions? Or are they going to say, hey, we don't want to be associated with this at all. We're not going to increase our relations, and we are going to just take a sideline to this. Russia, like, this is your thing. If you need help, we can help you some ways, but we are not going to be seen as we don't want to see this as Russia and China are doing anything to Ukraine. This is Russia doing something to Ukraine. It looks like they are honestly coming. It looks like right now they're trying to figure that out themselves. And so I would imagine, and again, this is going to be like we're not going to know the specifics on what diplomats are talking about each other because that stuff's classified, but it does look like China is trying to figure out, okay, what assets are we going to pull out of Russia? Because obviously the ruble is dropping in its worth, so they don't want to physically lose some of their money as well. It's not just about increasing relations, it's about their own assets. And what is the US's response? I know that the US and the EU have been talking about secondary sanctions. And so what secondary sanctions is additional sanctions on countries that are trying to help another country get around sanctions. So if we sanction one country, let's say we sanction a country's gas and oil company, and another country comes in and says, okay, well, if the United States is not going to buy oil from you guys, then we'll just buy oil from you. And so what the United States is going to do is say, okay, well, if you're going to buy oil from them and make them get around us, then we're just going to sanction you as well, which again is to prevent countries. It's not necessarily to get them to reverse that policy, but it's to prevent other countries from doing that. So I think right now with China is a great example of secondary sanctions working, is that it doesn't look like they are fully prepared to come to the rescue of Russia. And they are not fully prepared to be as much of an ally as Russia would probably want them to, because they rely very heavily on the EU, and they rely very heavily on the United States as well, and other Western aligned countries in, like South Korea or Japan and Australia as well. And so, yeah, that's going to be the big question. We don't know the answer to that quite yet. I'm sure a lot of U.S. diplomats are working with China to try to convince them to go on their side, and I'm sure a lot of Russian diplomats are trying to do the opposite. So that's going to be kind of up in the air. But that is going to be the next question: is what does China do? Are they going to buy more oil and gas? Are they going to increase relations, or are they going to try to sit on the sidelines in this one and then just kind of make diplomatic messages, and just say, oh yeah, we kind of support Russia, but then not actually physically support Russia?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. That's very interesting. Um, so, I mean, I think I've I've asked you basically everything I wanted to so far. I mean, is there any aspect of the conflict or more generally things that we've missed?
Um, I don't know. Right now, I guess the conflict. So some of the, I guess I'll go over back to which we talked about this earlier. So I don't know
Hmm.
if everybody was hearing it, but
Hmm.
um, I guess I can go back to some of the military positions and some of the movements and just kind of go over an overview of what we're looking for and what we're waiting for now.
Yeah.
So right now, the big things that we are waiting for is when is Kyiv, which is Ukraine's capital, going to be invaded? Most of the forces, like I mentioned earlier, are kind of to the northwest, the southwest, and the east of Kyiv, and they're going to try to position them around, make sure some of the logistical issues that Russia's been dealing with are dealt with before they invade Kyiv. So it does looks like they kind of have learned their lesson so far, and so that's going to be the next thing. And the other part is in the south is when do they take the port city of Odessa, which is once they've taken the port city of Odessa, they have essentially taken almost all of Ukraine's territory in the Black Sea, and Ukraine is officially landlocked at this point. So what's most likely going to happen is that after Kyiv falls, is that they're going to start moving the forces into like Chernihiv or Kharkiv, some of the other large big cities that have been taking a pause on Russian invasion because a lot of those forces have been moved over near Kyiv, and then we're most likely, unfortunately, going to start seeing cities just fall. I don't want to say left and right, but very, very quickly after Kyiv. The best case scenario for Ukraine is, well, the absolute best scenario for Ukraine is that they're able to push back Russian advances in Kyiv, and they are able to able to hold Kyiv the entire time. That is extremely unlikely because they have far less forces than Russia does in the area. But yeah, hopefully the next best case scenario is that hopefully Ukraine is able to move their command and control, which I mentioned earlier, what C2 and command and control is. Hopefully they are able to move their command and control outside of Kyiv. Lviv is another city that they possibly going to be able to do. And hopefully their military is able to push back Russia as much as they have been, and not take a huge hit militarily by Kyiv falling. Hopefully they're also able to continue their insurgency in Kyiv and just make it impossible for Russian forces to hold any of the big cities. That's going to be the biggest strategy from Ukraine right now, is that Russia is going to have to deal with essentially a two-front war of they are trying to take cities and they are also trying to hold cities, but both seem to be very difficult. It's very difficult for them to take cities in the first place, and then when they do hold a city, it's essentially impossible because the insurgency is so difficult that there's no way for them to. They have to waste so much energy just holding the city rather than which they should be doing, which is going around taking other cities. So that's going to be the big strategy from Ukraine right now, is trying to just push back on Russian advances as long as possible, because a lot of NATO countries are going to be sending in some of the military Air Force assets, which I guess will mention a little tidbit on that. A lot of people have been, seems like, kind of confused on how Ukraine is able to get Air Force. How do we train them? How do we, if we send them an airplane, do we have to retrain them? So in Air Force, so like there are essentially a few different types of, not types of airplanes, but there are airplanes that are used by NATO and there are airplanes that are used mostly by Russia. Ukraine and some of the other former Soviet Union countries still have airplanes that are used by Russia. And so places like Poland and Romania have a lot of the same airplanes that Ukraine does. So they don't, like Su-29s or Su-27s or MiG-29s. So a lot of the airplanes that they're going to be sending are essentially airplanes that they don't need to retrain pilots. Ukraine already knows how to use them. So Poland and Romania will likely send a lot of their older planes that Ukraine knows how to use, and then just probably buy like either F-35s or F-16s from the United States to compensate for that. But yeah, so right now Ukraine has been getting a lot of a lot of help. Their strategy is going to be try to create an insurgency and then not waste as much time, but push back on a Russian advance as long as possible, so that way they can get as many assets and forces, whether it's guns, javelins, aircraft, like I mentioned. I know. I guess one thing we talk about is a no-fly zone. I'm sure a lot of people on the left has not really been arguing for this, but a lot of people have been pushing for that. In fact, Zelensky himself has mentioned that he wanted NATO to institute a no-fly zone. But
yeah, so what's your view on that?
Yeah, so for those people who don't know, a no-fly zone, which is essentially just in the name, means you set up a zone where no flights are allowed to take place. We did this in the former Yugoslavia. We've done this in Iraq after the Gulf War, and then, like I mentioned earlier, we did this in Libya, and I believe we did it in a few other areas, but I can't remember. But essentially, what the argument for a no-fly zone would be that the United States sets up a no-fly zone around the entire area of Ukraine. It prevents Russia from being able to use its forces and drop bombs. And it essentially would very much hurt Russian advances. So the problem with that, besides, we'll not even get into the fact that obviously getting in a shooting war with Russia could possibly start World War III, and two nuclear powers shooting at each other is probably not great. Just the logistical side, almost every single time we have done a no-fly zone, it has been with a military that is very small, and it has already been in areas where there were not a lot of flights happening. So in Yugoslavia, which was probably the hardest no-fly zone we did in the 90s, was still pretty successful because NATO air power was just so overpowering to the former Yugoslavia countries, and they were just not really able to break it. And then also in Iraq, after the Gulf War, the Iraqi Air Force was already almost completely destroyed, and so there were only like 3 or 4 times where an Iraqi aircraft broke the no-fly zone. We actually had to shoot them down. Whereas in this situation, it would be the Russian Air Force would be 100%. They're not just going to say, okay, there's a no-fly zone, I guess we're not flying here. They are 100% going to say, okay, we need to take out every U.S. aircraft to try to continue to do bombing raids or continue to send in transport aircraft. So this is going to be a very, very difficult, essentially the world's most difficult no-fly zone. And so just on the logistical side, we would have to send a lot of aircraft in there. We could probably do it logistically, but it would just be extremely difficult to enforce. We would be losing a lot of different aircraft. We would be losing a lot of people. And which gets in the next part, Russia is 100% going to see this as the United States invading Russian forces. You know, people have talked about, well, we can just keep it as a no-fly zone. We can send in forces. When you are doing international relations, one of the biggest things is messaging. If I'm sure plenty of people have always heard the phrase perception is reality, which a lot of times they hear that, maybe from your parents or something. And so, but in this situation, perception is 100% reality. If the United States or NATO is not trying to start a war with Russia, but if Russia perceives that the United States and NATO has started a war with Russia, then it literally does not matter. You have started a war with Russia. Yeah. And so what the United States and NATO need to do, which I've talked about this earlier on the foreign policy side, we need to have a cohesive strategy, and we need to have a unified strategy that everyone in NATO can agree with. Almost every single NATO partner has already said that they're not willing to do this, so I don't think this is something that they're legitimately considering. It's mostly a lot of people on Twitter have been mentioning that they think they should do it, and then also Zelensky himself has said that they should do it. So maybe they are considering it a little bit more now, but we should never, especially the last thing we want to do is have the United States just go in there and then make it seem like, cowboy United States is going in there and just guns a-blazing, doing its own thing and completely disregarding what NATO wants to do. We should be doing everything as a cohesive strategy. So if we're in a situation where all of NATO has agreed to do a no-fly zone, then maybe that's a better argument, because now you have essentially a much larger group of forces. But even then, logistically, it's going to be extremely difficult. And that's when you raise the possible of nuclear strikes. And And so with nuclear strikes, I guess I can talk about this a little bit. There's essentially two types of nuclear strikes. You can do large strategic nuclear strikes where you take out Paris or something like that, where you take out a large city, and then you have non-strategic tactical nuclear weapons, which are not going to be used on large civilian populations necessarily, but are essentially going to be a counterbalance to a bunch of bombs. So what I mean by that is, let's say if Russia was going to take out a bunch of Ukrainian forces and they were going to drop 100 bombs or something like that. Now, they were already going to bomb it. It's not like a huge, that is obviously terrible, but that's not like a huge escalation on Russia's side. But it would be even better if they could just drop one smaller tactical nuclear weapon and then just waste less money and waste less logistics. So that would be an example of a non-strategic tactical nuclear weapon that is not meant to escalate nuclear war, even though it possibly will, but it's just used for like a logistical purpose because it's just a lot easier to drop one bomb than it is 100. So the chance of a tactical non-strategic nuclear weapon are a lot higher. I still don't think it's going to happen, but it's a lot higher in that situation than it is for Russia to decide that they're going to start, nuking Warsaw, or they're going to, nuke the next closest city.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that a no-fly zone is just not really something that's ready to happen right now. The big question is what if Russia does use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? At that point, I don't even want to begin to think of what happens if that does happen. But, right now, I think, like I mentioned earlier, right now, I think NATO and EU's response has been as close to flawless as you can. I think they've done a really amazing job. They came together. They had a fractured NATO that was not sure on what its response was. That seemed like the United States was the only country that was really willing to push back on Russia, to now the United States is taking a backseat. It's letting Europe be the leader in this situation, which is an amazing strategy by the Biden administration, because it totally goes against what Russia's messaging is, which is, okay, Europe, Russia, or United States is just using you guys as pawns. And so obviously Russia is not able to make that argument. And it shows a unified, more together NATO, which is much stronger than if we just had one or two countries going against it. So I think in general, our response has been really good. We should keep it that way. We don't need to escalate anything. We don't need to make it any harder for countries to come up with a unified strategy by doing something like a no-fly zone. And I think most defense analysts would agree I don't even want to begin about how difficult that would be to even institute. So I don't think it's something that's going to happen.
I'm getting at least 3 reasons for no-fly zone, right? One, possibility of provoking nuclear attack. Two, the difficulty of instituting it, and the amount of losses there would be. And 3, it would undermine the kind of unified front that Europe and the US and NATO have shown.
Exactly. Yeah, those are the big 3 reasons. Obviously, if everybody in NATO agrees that no-fly zone is good, which they obviously don't, then you take away that 3rd option, but you still have the possibility of it's going to be extremely difficult, and it could possibly escalate nuclear war.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So thank you very much. If that's everything, because I've got to ask you every question. I think I had about 20 written down. I managed to ask them all indirectly, if not directly. It's been very interesting. Chat has been. Oh, there you go! Congratulations, you've received 1,000 messages today. So I've never had that before. So that tells you what chat's been like. No. So you I should let you plug yourself, right? You're starting a YouTube channel, or you have started it.
Yeah, so I haven't put a video out yet. I was talking to UE about this earlier. I was going to put out a video on the Russia-Ukraine situation. It kind of took too long, and then by the time I was going to post it, Russia had already invaded, so it was kind of pointless at that point, because most of my video was about what happens if Russia invades, and it obviously already happened. A good thing is that I was right. Most of my video would have been accurate, which would have been nice, but I guess you cut your losses there. But yeah, I'm on Twitter at Noam Kissinger. Again, I'll say it one more time. I'm not a Henry Kissinger fan. I'm not he's a war criminal. Trust me, I do not like him. So, I'm not a Noam Chomsky stan or anything. I'm just like a general gross liberal or whatever. So yeah, if you guys want to follow me on Twitter, I do have my YouTube channel linked. I believe I do. If I don't, you guys can just follow me on Twitter at Noam Kissinger. I talk about international relations, defense policy stuff. Yeah, just if you're more of a lefty type person, then I would say embrace NATOism. Take the Bosch pill and embrace, pro-Ukrainian NATO. So yeah, that's my general plug. Hopefully I'll be doing maybe I'll be doing some streams, or I'll be doing some videos sometime soon. I'll be talking to Unlearning Economics about sanctions as well, and then some other foreign policy stuff.
Do you mean Econo Boy?
Oh wait, what did I? Oh, sorry. Yes,
yeah, you're already talking.
Oh, I'm sorry.
To me.
Yeah. I'm already talking to you. I'm talking to Econo Boy. Sorry, too many econ people.
Yeah.
Get them all confused. Yeah, I'll be talking to Econo Boy sometime in late March. He's going to start streaming as well. So yeah, I'll be talking to him about foreign policy. So if you guys want to follow me on Twitter, that's mostly where I'm at right now. And then I'll probably be starting my YouTube channel. But if you follow me on Twitter, I can. You guys can see whenever I join YouTube and stuff.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Thanks so many of you for showing up and for the lively debate and the discussion. After the beginning, you were actually nice to each other, so I'm grateful for that. Okay.
Ended really good.
Yeah. So I'm gonna stop the stream now. See you later, everybody.